Well, hey, it's Polly here. Aha, with the gang behind me. Yeah, so I've just been doing some game design, and I thought as a little tea talk, we would do a little look at the design process involved. It's been an interesting task. So, tea with dragonflies, my other favourite animal on earth. So, let's set the long ago clock, shall we? So, here is my one of my more precious possessions. This is my original D&D set from 1976, I think I got this one. So it includes, Greyhawk and Blackmoor and all the rest. You can see they've sort of weathered the years pretty damn well, right down to the damn dice. But amongst the original D&D games, there was one that I adored. It's the supplement from the Greyhawk era of D&D, 0 edition, that everyone kind of forgot about. Swords and Spells. This is a recent reprint. My original did not survive the years. I adored this. This is by Gary Gygax. Now what they did was, as you recall, Chainmail was a medieval battle war game with miniatures. It ran off a number of D6 mechanisms. It kind of provided the spark for the original Dungeons & Dragons 0 edition role-playing game. That is... Where are we? Sorry, that's Blackmoor. So, yeah. So, we've got this edition. So, we have war games roots in our role-playing games hobby, as we have discussed. Swords and Spells was a miniatures game designed to dovetail precisely with Dungeons & Dragons. So it was basically Dungeons & Dragons writ large. I've done a review of it, but let's say that, consistent with most 1970s rules, what it did was you had different base sizes for different sorts of troops, so you got more or less concentrations of troops. So like a spearsmen might be on a half-inch base, but skirmishers might be on a 1-inch base, so you get only half as many of them in the frontage, which means they tend to lose if they fight against guys who are packed, fighting them 2 to 1. Okay, fair enough. Now, what Swords and Spells did was, it effectively said that we're going to take averages. So, if, for instance, someone at that stage was armor class 2, you would normally be hitting them on an 18 or higher, on a d20. Alright, so 18, 19, 20, that's 15%. 15% of all attacks will result in a hit, and then they decided, well, we've got weapons with damage. So that means you could start to get an average amount of damage that a unit would throw out into its opponent. So what it did was, rather awkwardly, gave you a series of charts. And I mean there's pages of these, you can see. So what you had to do was, when you figured out what the armor class was, and that would give you a percentage, and then you'd have to look up what weapon you're using, and that would give you another number. That's the amount of damage that unit has kind of chucked onto the enemy. And then, given the hit points of that enemy, it gave you essentially how many figures were going to be removed as casualties. So there was there's 3 steps of charts to index, and cross-index. There's also no variation for damage. It was entirely averages. So a flawed game, you could home rule it, which we did. We rolled damage rather than used average damage, so at least things weren't just eternally the same. But because Greyhawk had bonuses and negatives for different sorts of weapons, that also brought something into it. So because there was limited availability of figures at that time, I remember one guy, he had some Wars of the Roses minifigs knights, and they all had Warhammers with picks pick ends facing forwards or sitting there. So, okay, he's got his guys with picks. All right, well, they only do a d6 of damage, but they did get like a +2 or 3 on their armor piercing roll. So, hey, that's not a bad idea. So anyway, you can see how that runs. I loved it. The first armies I ever made were minifigs, pig-snouted orcs. I will love them forever. With Berdishas and glaive geese and fushards and all that sort of stuff. They were great. But I think the rules are essentially unplayable. Now, this is a shame because in fantasy, often fantasy stories and books are set during times of war and conflict, and there's no reason why role-playing games cannot be set during similar times of war and conflict, and often they are. But D&D still needs a system where you can dovetail massed military endeavours in with the role-playing, as well as just having a battle game you can simply play for the love of playing a miniatures war game. So that was a task I set myself. Essentially replace swords and spells. Create something with a modern design aesthetic that means simplicity of play, and it means instead of charts and cross-references, let the dice tell you the tale without having to cross-reference things. So, game design is my job. So I sat down to think the things we need in this are resource management in a fun way, and risk and reward, not just from the tactical choices made. Do you expose that unit? Do you try swinging around? Do you reinforce it? No. There has to be like some risk reward in the gameplay. So yeah, it's an interesting task to look at. Plus, it should echo Dungeons and Dragons, particularly its earlier iterations. So, 0 edition, basic through to advanced BSM, and advanced D&D. It should embrace those, and of course any OSR, old school Renaissance rules that you happen to be playing. It should work with that. However, that kind of conceit that Swords and Spells had of exactly just using D&D rules written large, that has to go. You can't quite do that. Okay, so what my first choices were, none of this individual figures and breaking units down for change. Let's go to what we call an element system. So there will be a base which has multiple figures on it, miniatures, and this represents a group of guys, I've said a company, around about 100 people, who are fighting in a fight style. So for instance, a company of, say, Roman legionaries, armoured guys with shields, they're using heavy throwing weapons, they close with swords. Pikemen, knights with lances, this is a fighting style that they share. Then let's pick what these fighting styles are. So things are going to have a type. They're going to be shock troops, or they're going to be skirmishers, or they're going to be missile troops. Or I've made another one which I've just called sword and shot, which are like Sassanid noble cavalry, or samurai, medieval samurai, groups who use missile fire and shock action. They're not as devastating as like a charge of lanced cavalry, but they're also not as vulnerable. It's not do or die. They try and weaken the enemy with missile attacks and spoiling attacks and so on. And if that's not working, they tend to withdraw away. So that's a reason why those styles, Mamluks, Turkish Sipahi, that's why they were essentially survived pretty much into the modern day, because it's not do or die. You don't commit your cavalry, and if they win, they win, and if they lose, you've lost them and you've probably lost the battle. So, little choices like this. But let's also let you build pretty much whatever you need to do to make characteristics for a unit. Oh, it's Australia, there is a fly. So those characteristics have to include things like weapons. This could be a unit that uses pikes, which is going to be a thing, or two-handed weapons, or say pole arms such as halberds. It could be the unit has battle beasts, some kind of raving animals that they release. For some reason, these guys could be crack shots. They could be creatures that climb. They could be amphibious creatures like, say, traditional D&D lizard men who don't care about water obstacles and marsh. It could be creatures that are unusually swift. It could be creatures that fly. You have to be able to build this in. I kept the concept of levels, and that ports straight over from the game, but I put in guidelines about how that reflects with like humanoid troops. So, militia and rabble will be like a level 0, which is a concept that turned up kind of in advanced D&D. Level 1 is your typical kind of soldier. Level 2 are going to be like veterans and so on. They've been at the campaigning, got a lot of experience, but these guys are usually rare on the ground. Level 3 is some sort of elite. These are your city mighty, guards of the warlord, or the Orcish chieftain's prize warband, that sort of thing. But it could go up to like level 5 for some sort of crazy elite group of paladin knights or something like that. But that will be rare as hen's teeth. I put in a costing system for points so that you can try and create balanced armies. I also put in some sample army lists so you could see what sort of forces you could buy using that. Armor class, I decided let's preserve armor class from the original game. So we've got armor class and level have ported over. But we're not worried about individual weapons and so on. It's like there's dozens of people and these things are used. What we're more interested in is your style. Are you line infantry, like spearsmen who are great at holding a defensive line and in attack grind forward, like Greek hoplites or Swiss pikemen? Are you shock troops like Roman legionaries or crazed tribesmen who close and destroy with the enemy with heavy throwing weapons or impact weapons or crazy shield walls, these sorts of things. So the next thing I thought we would need is to try and preserve that initiative system that is so much a part of all the D&D iterations. So original D&D used D6s, so I said let's make this a game that uses D20s and D6s. So we've got the hallmark D20 as a core mechanism, but we'll keep sort of D6 for initiatives and so on. So my end idea was essentially let us have a resource management system. This has worked out very well in playtesting. Every single company you have on the field, you roll 1d6 for each one. But for each general, you roll 2 or 3 d6, depending on how talented that general is. Or you might even roll more if you've paid for good staff, couriers, spies, etc. You roll these, and then you can commit these dice to the different units that you have. Anything that you've committed a dice with a 6 to, they're going to move first. Everything with a 6 moves. You've made a roll but between the players initially, by the way, for each turn, so that one of you will be doing the first move for each of these numerical values. But 6s move first, and when they move, you then figure out any combats that have come from these guys smacking into contact with someone. Then the 5s will all move, 4s, 3s, 2s, 1s. Now you've got excess dice. What you can do is do reinforcement dice. So here's where your resource management comes in, and it's been kind of fun. You will always have extra dice because you've got generals. You can put these dice as a reinforcement dice and tag them onto any company. To tag it onto a company, you have to have a reinforcement dice that is equal to or higher than its initiative value. So there's a little bit of choice there. You're going to have to figure out how to use these dice. If a unit has a reinforcement dice on it, you can use it in combat. It will give you an advantage in combat. You can also use it to do extra movement. You can also use it to interrupt someone else's movement and take an opportunity move on them. You can also hold dice back in reserve that you don't commit to specific units, and in the morale phase at the end of the turn, you can use these to repair disorder that has happened to your troops. You are rallying the troops. So, someone's charge or a shower of arrows has, rattled the unit, broken the line and made them vulnerable. You can spend these reinforcements dice to, repair the damage. So that's been a nice resource. The thing is, you've also got to watch your generals, because some of them you can gain bonuses by attaching generals to units, and that gives that unit a bonus. However, if that guy dies because being exposed in combat is dangerous, then you've lost the extra initiative dice that person rolls, so you become more vulnerable. Now, another thing that I decided to do for morale was, as your army takes casualties, you're going to start getting less dice. So if you lose a quarter of your initial number of companies, you start discarding all the initiative dice that you roll that get a 6. So that, it starts to tell your guys are, wearing down a bit. So, it's been a good mechanism. Combat, D20s. However, we're not rolling specific armor classes. You get an advantage in close combat if you have better armor than the other side. You get an advantage if you played one of these advantage dices. You get advantage if you have an inspiring general with you. You get advantage if something about the terrain, such as the enemy is having to attack you by going uphill to meet you, or your enemy is disordered. Advantage, every cause of advantage that you have is an extra d20 that you roll. Both sides roll their d20s and they keep the one with the highest results. Natural 20s always get you a special result, but that winner will essentially put disorder onto the other side, and if they've beaten him by about 5 points, they'll remove a level from him. Now here's where the risk reward comes in. This is the initial bash of troops. You can now decide, if you're the attacker, to double down, and that's where you bet double or nothing. You can do extra damage if you play another combat round with your opponent, and there are high rewards for doing that follow-up. You are more likely to do damage to him in levels and so on, which is more decisive than just disrupting him. But if you fail, you kind of take the same level of damage. So you only want to do it if you really think that you have an advantage in this fight. But that double or nothing gives you that risk and reward that's missing from so many games. You can play the cautious game and just grind someone back, or you can just go for broke. But if you go for broke, you can get a weapon. So, it's been a nice system. I hope you can see. Missile Fire very specifically uses the armor class system. You're rolling essentially 3d20 for a missile firing unit. Some units are dedicated missile fire units, like longbowmen, but you can also get skirmishers, and the shot and sword units can also fire missiles. Shot and swords of infantry are people like peltasts or amugdfars and so on, who, again, they throw javelins and so forth, but they're willing to close into close combat. But they're very useful for chasing off skirmishers and holding open ground. Or, like I said, people who like combine sword and bow action, like a lot of Islamic heavy cavalry and so on. So yeah, but you're rolling 3 dice and you are trying to equal or exceed the other side's armor class. In all of these rolls, by the way, both in melee and in Missile Fire, your level adds to your dice rolls, exactly the way it does in original D&D. So you're rolling to beat actual armor class, so actual armor class counts, and the number of hits that you get on someone, it normally does disorder, but it can do levels of damage if you get 2 or more hits. In essence, what Missile Fire does is it breaks up attacks. It disorders enemies so that it makes them more difficult to move, because disordered groups, if they've got 2 disorder counters on them, they can no longer move, and disordered units are vulnerable in melee. So basically, the old War Games term is you're shooting someone in. You have those longbowmen rain arrows down on someone, disorder them, and then your knights attack them. That's a classic. So I've put in a list of monsters. Now, many monsters in D&D are not suitable for the battlefield. They're an individual single thing. You're not going to be able to get a small group of them and convince them long enough not to eat you and instead, eat the other guys. Even some kind of charm monster spells won't really do that for long. But there are some things, like you can get ogres. They're willing to work for you. You might have creatures that are used as mounts. You can ride elephants. You might be able to ride, I don't know, if you found one, a triceratops, a giant stag beetle, these sorts of things. But many of these roll over into like a characteristic for a unit. Battle beasts, you've got a couple of strange things, or many of them are mounts for crazy generals, but they're not suited for like cavalry. Cavalry mounts have to be something that's relatively easy to train and handle. Horses, but maybe things like, camels obviously, axe beaks, wargs, these sorts of things. But you aren't going to get a unit riding manticores. These things are very solitary, very hard to find. There's not enough of them to suddenly have 100 guys riding a unit, and they're vicious and they'll turn on each other and everything. So but flying creatures like pegasi and hippogriffs and giant eagles and giant owls and so on are definitely. Dragons and so on can make an interesting thing to add into a game. We want our colourful fancy creatures, but I took the monsters and I said, all right, let's split them into intelligent and unintelligent. Here's the thing. A company of monsters can have a big influence on the battlefield. Often they're quite high level, which means it's easy for them to hit, and it's hard for them to be killed. They also make such great miniatures. But what I have said is that there are intelligent and unintelligent monsters. Intelligent monsters tend to sod off if the going gets tough. You don't get to be an ancient dragon by hanging around battlefields where a lot of people are starting to, poke artillery bolts into you. So, anytime these larger creatures take damage, at the end of that turn in the morale phase, you're rolling a d6. If you get equal to or less than the number of levels they've lost, an intelligent monster will depart the battlefield. That's it. Bye. I've done my bit. Non-intelligent monsters have a similar role, but in their case they have a chance of rampaging. So they might start turning on the nearest units that they can find and attacking them. You can pay reinforcement dice to try and keep them in control, but now they become, as you can see, a suck. They are costing you initiative dice in order to just stop them stomping on your own people. And I think it has to be a high scoring initiative dice to do it. And if any monster takes half of its levels in damage, it will just go. That's it. Bye. It's running. So they're useful but fragile in some ways. They can cause a lot of damage, but they can suddenly disappear, which is good. It's a monster. It's not troops. It's a fickle thing to have in battle. Stuff that was in the original chainmail rules, they had a siege system. I wanted to preserve that. Sieges should be part of fantasy gaming. So I put a whole siege system in. I split the siege system so there are siege turns which take 2 weeks. And at any stage, the attacker can suddenly decide, I'm trying an assault, in which case it switches to being a battle game. You deploy your companies and you try and storm the castle. But during the siege turns, you are digging trenches, you are constructing siege material. You're making fascines, you're trying to build battering rams and siege engines, you're trying to construct ladders, you're trying to dig mines, these sorts of things. The garrison can do sorties. They can come out and attempt to attack the works. Part of the resource management for the siege guys is they have to have companies that are dedicated to each of their construction jobs. They have to have a camp, and they can nominate groups to be on guard, but groups that are on guard or constructing become fatigued, which means they become more vulnerable in combat. So you've got to have some people in camp, some people on guard, and some people like digging the trenches and making palisades and the works, and those guys are actually positioned on the board. If the sortie from the garrison comes out, only the guard units can react to it. Everyone else was in camp. Sorties tend to come raging out at night and this sort of thing. And sorties can, if they overrun works and so on, they destroy them. If they get to the camp, they can essentially destroy supplies. So what happens is you've got a set number of turns for the siege before winter and the rain set in and you really can't keep this going. If sorties manage to get to the camp and destroy supplies, essentially they shorten the game. So an active defence can be fun, but you've got to watch out. You can get all sorts of bad things happening. So you have to be careful. You have to be very careful how you do it. So yeah, it's a strategic game. Catapults nibble away at walls, battering rams nibble away at gates, siege towers can be used to get over walls and so on. You can harass people with flying skirmishes and so on. So, it's all in there. So, in the end, just a friend having a parcel delivered. In the end, I hope what has happened is a game where you can port things over from D&D. When you get those high-level characters that somehow suddenly get a stronghold and, have knights and men-at-arms suddenly turn up, those are your companies. You're getting those. You can have characters that become rulers and warlords and heads of mighty alliances, and this can be part of your role-playing game. You can port over your favourite monsters and your favourite creatures and your favourite sort of fantasy kingdoms and so on, and you can just play them. So it still dovetails in with original Dungeons and Dragons without having to worry about making a completely different system. Armor classes are in there, levels are in there, initiative is in there. If your elves, they gain a +1 for firing their bows, then they count in the rules as crack shots. They get a +1 when they're firing their bows. It's all in there. But it's in there with a modern design aesthetic. So no charts, no tables. The only thing you need to do is check, because there are circumstances in which your type of troops, it matters. You are charging cavalry against line infantry that are standing firm. That's very hard for you to break. In D&D terms, remember, set spear against charge, doubles its damage. Same goes with polearms. Those sorts of things are in there. And there are differences sometimes between the first and second round of battles that double down. So, sword and shot troops are not quite as vulnerable in that second turn of battle. They can, particularly if they are being attacked, instead of standing and taking it, they can try and withdraw away, and those sorts of things. So it's got a good tactical flavour, which is what was missing from Swords and Spells and Chainmail. That fighting style. If you want your orcish hordes to be a bit like, say, Dark Age Franks, so raging hordes of tribesmen who are screaming into the attack, preceded by a huge rain of throwing axes and heavy spears and so on. Great, that sounds like orcs. If you want to put a tag on them that they are savage, which means that if your opponent has causes of disruption to them, they can claw their way into the formation really easily, so they get a bonus. But savage troops are very jealous of each other, so if you put reinforcement dice onto a savage unit, the neighbours, if they haven't got a reinforcement dice, they can be resentful, and you roll a dice. They might attack the guys that you first reinforced, or they might simply refuse to move, or they might decide to go goony-goo-hoo and try and outdo the ones that you've given a reinforcement dice to, and get an extra move and charge into enemy contact. It's got flavour to it. Beyond that, Swords and Spells, stiffness, everything has this move, the damage is always the same. And what matters is whether I'm holding a pick, not whether my group are skirmishers or whether my group are our pike phalanx or what have you. So, it's been an interesting design task. Preserve recognisable mechanisms from D&D. Allow a flawless rollover for monsters and magical creatures. Allow characters, player characters, to be a part of these games. If you have a character and it's running a unit or it's a general, there are rules for what happens to that character and how they directly influence the battle. So that D&Dism has to be preserved, and so did the quintessential dice mechanisms. The original D6 for initiative and the D20s for attacks. But to bring in resource management in a fun way so that there's some real gamesmanship going on, and to bring in a style that means no charts and no tables. Let the dice tell you what's going on. And let's put in what's missing from so many miniatures games, which is risk reward. So that double down idea, I think, is an important one. Another idea that was just hovering in this was how expensive miniatures have gotten. 25mm figures are ridiculous. Those old minifigs that I loved, they are still in production, by the way. You can get them through Caliver Books UK. So the old pig-snouted orc minifigs are still alive and well. They're something like £4.75 a miniature. If you go looking for even printable miniatures, they're really expensive, and not many of us can afford a 3D printer of our own. If you're making a base that's got like 8 miniatures on it, that could be 40, 50, 60 bucks. So another idea I've had with this is to do some kind of a system that welcomes using cardboard or paper printout miniatures. So I'm going to try and work out some card printed bases with slots in them that you can essentially put slotted miniatures into, which are card standees, so that you can just sit down and play it. You can either print them yourself, or maybe we'll see about printing them. I think printing them is a good idea, because we could do pre-printed packs with army lists provided. So if you want an elven army or whatever, great, here's the punch out standees for it. You want the skeleton horde, you want the horde of the dark Dracolich or whatever, we can do these, and they'll cost you like $5-10, and here's an army. Or hell, you can just draw, colour and print out your own. That should be a legitimate style, particularly for role-playing gamers who want to do a fun military campaign but don't want to spend $3,000 in order to add that into their role-playing sessions. So those were the tasks that I looked at. That's how I approached them, and that's what I hope has now turned into a game that is very, very playable and kind of a worthy part of the OSR family. I'm hoping, looks like we'll be getting this out through Wizard Tower Games. I hope they're keen on it. So anyway, I thought I'd just give you a little look at a game design process in action, as it were. The task and the constraints within that task, and how it was handled, and how I looked at what I consider to be the things that make a good game. My playtesting opponent, Mr. Snoots, has quite successfully beaten the snot out of me using hordes of giant ants. We had high elves, which we said were sword and shot cavalry, kind of plate mail with a shield to fall back on when they're in melee. But yeah, they got the cavalry with longbows. Again, they were elven bows. They will shower shot upon you, and then they'll charge in. So they're not quite as goony goo as Western Knights. I did armies for a fantasy city-state, basically based on city-state, the Invincible Overlord, one of my favourite settings from old school. And so yes, that's pikemen and mercenary crossbowmen, and not pikemen, spearsmen, mercenary crossbowmen, knights, some local crazy noble youths on Pegasi, the town militia, longbow wielding foresters, some incredibly crap peasant slingers, which turned out to be a absolute scream. Level 0 slingers with no armor whatsoever were and reluctant, so that their morale is fragile, were incredibly fun because they were very, very cheap and incredibly, incredibly annoying. There's been some good test games so far. So anyway, that's been the task. That's been how I handle it. Those are the game design thoughts and considerations. So just thought you might enjoy a little look at my process as I cook up with a game that hopefully will be in production later this year. Anyway, he's going to cook up more ways of beating the snot out of me in a game. And I will talk to you guys later on and drink more tea. Okay, bye.